Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for spending some time with us today. My comment mainly is that spring is very close. I don't know about you down in South Jersey or wherever you might be, but I am tired of shoveling snow here. So that said, we're going to talk about something that I will be very candid in telling you. Having grown up and gone through my schooling in New Jersey, I never knew anything about till 5 or 6 years ago. And that is that New Jersey has always been, unfortunately, in its history, a slave state, as were, frankly, all the original 13 colonies. We were also, embarrassingly enough, to me, the last northern state to abolish slavery. And so we're going to talk about that. And as Valerie said, as I go through this, rather than me talk to a screen, which I get lost in, please send her a chat. She'll interrupt me with whatever questions you might have. So here we go. I'll bet everyone here has seen this picture, this painting. It's a very famous, iconic painting, many, many times in their lives, probably from, I don't know, kindergarten or first grade. And of course, it's George Washington and the men crossing the Delaware at a place called McConkey's Ferry. They're going over on the left to the New Jersey side in December of 1776 to confront the British. And the rest, as we like to always say, is history. Now, it's a made-up, a patriotic painting. The painter painted this a good 75 years after the event, so it probably did not look like this even a little bit. Nonetheless, we know what they were doing, right? These guys were fighting for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which is terrific. It's part of our founding ethos in this country. But the question I want to pose, and I have posed with this book and today, is that's great, but whose? And the answer, as you know, I hope, is that they were fighting for life, liberty, and pursuit of white landowners. That's just the way they were thinking in those days. But if you look closely at this image, which I never did until very recently, right there in front of George Washington is a black man. And although the painter was not there to observe that, he obviously knew something because that is based on a real historic person. And there's another image of this man in the back. And that man with the horse is William Billy Lee. And he's probably just set up George Washington's tent there. You probably know that George Washington, during the Revolutionary War, spent more time in New Jersey in various battles than everywhere else. We are called, for that reason, the cockpit of the Revolution. And every day, Billy Lee was basically George Washington's personal assistant. But the bad news is he was also his slave, because it turned out that Washington bought Billy Lee several years before the Revolutionary War for 61 colonial pounds. And all through the war, as you can see here, Billy Lee made his meals, set up his tent, and took care of his horses, sent messages back and forth, whatever he had to do. And the irony in this French image, frankly, is that while Billy Lee's in the background attending to George's horse, George Washington is holding the Declaration of Independence. Now, to put in perspective what 61 pounds might have meant around that time, you could have bought then 8 horses or 13 cows, or if you were a tradesperson, a blacksmith or a carpenter, it would take you the better part of 2 years to make that kind of money. And I use these analogies on purpose because slaveholders in the early days of our country, and elsewhere for that matter, thought of slaves as property, not as full human beings. So that was a substantial amount of money that somebody would have paid for, in those days, another human being. And it turned out that Lee was with George all through the Revolutionary War. Later on, he retired with him down to Mount Vernon in Virginia. And some very odd things happened along the way. You would think that George Washington would be on very, very intimate terms with this man that he basically lived with during this period. And that's certainly true. But because he owned him, he didn't think of him in the same way as he thought of other folks that he knew in those days. And as a testimony to that, and again, kind of embarrassingly, toward the end of the war, when Billy Lee fell in love with a black woman named Margaret Thomas, he asked George if he could bring her down to Mount Vernon after the war. And Washington hesitated. And it's an amazing thing to think that he would not immediately say, well, of course. Now, the folks down in Mount Vernon say that there's no record that this woman ever showed up with Billy Lee. So she may have died, they think, before he was able to marry her and bring her down. But nonetheless, it's kind of an example of how slaveholders, no matter how close they were to their individual chattel slaves, felt. Now, just to give you another insight, here's another painting, of course, probably very far from reality. And it's George with what looked like very, well-attended slaves in the fields of Mount Vernon, and they're being refreshed, and they look like they've eaten very well under his, very nice gaze. And it's probably very far from the truth. You should know, I hope, that George Washington and Martha had over 300 slaves in Mount Vernon when he died around the turn of the century. And this is not to say that they didn't treat individually slaves with, some kind of kindness, but the vast majority of them were treated as all slaves were. They had no choice in what they did. They were at the beck and call of the Washingtons. At George Washington's death, by his last will and testament, he only freed Billy Lee. It's astounding. Now, part of that is that he couldn't free all the slaves. Here's another image of George and Martha. These happen to be Martha's two natural grandchildren, because it turns out she was married to a man named Daniel Custis, who had obviously died before she married George. And so she brought into the marriage with George what were called dower slaves that she had inherited. You can see, by the way, Billy Lee in the background here. This is an image that was done in Mount Vernon. And so it turns out that George did not have the ability, even if he had wanted to free some of the slaves by law that she brought into the marriage. They were hers, not his. Nonetheless, he still, for his own slaves, only saw fit to free one man. Martha, as you can see, brought in almost 100 slaves into the marriage. And guess what? In her last will and testament in the early 19th century, she only freed one. So this is emblematic of how slaveholders felt, even famous, founding families of our country back in those days. Now, Martha had a really, really horrible attitude toward African Americans. She would have looked at them differently. Here's an earlier picture of her that you may not have seen, a painting. And that kind of abhorrent statement that she made shows you how not only Martha and George, but other folks of the time thought about Black people. And the irony here is, why would anybody expect gratitude from people whose lives they were determining? So it's just, again, kind of shocking to, although we all kind of know these things, to see this from such famous people. To give you an example of that, there was a woman that Martha owned, a very young woman, named Ona, or Oni as she called her, Judge. And the story goes that Oni was a seamstress for Martha and had assumed for a long time that she would be freed when Martha died. But she overheard a conversation one day that Martha was going to sell her. And so she did what anybody would do in that situation. She ran away when she was 23 years old. And then this horrible episode begins where the Washington family, George was still alive at the point, and they hire some folks to go find her. And they run her down as best as they can with these agents to try to bring her back into enslavement. They take ads out in newspapers describing her as best they could. And these are very common ads that you see in the time for runaway slaves. And they finally located her, one of their agents located her, and tried to convince her to come back. Now, of course, why would you do that? But she decided that she would if they would guarantee that she would be manumitted. And what happened was that even though they had looked for her for years and she was ostensibly free, although not legally free at that time, when through this agent, she said to them, let's talk about my freedom. George Washington refused to negotiate with this young woman because he said it would reward unfaithfulness. And what he's talking about there is a very common attitude. And the attitude was that if she comes back and gets promised her freedom, the Washingtons, like anybody else in those days who owned slaves, were afraid that it would encourage other people to run away. So these are kind of astounding facts, to me at least, that I had never heard about the Washingtons. The good news for Ona is that she never did go back into enslavement, lived and got married in New Hampshire until her death almost into the middle of the next century. But again, just an emblematic story that was very more common than you would suspect at the early part of our country. Another person that you might know very well, maybe not by this image, who's got a lot of influence in New Jersey, believe it or not, is William Penn. We all know him as the founder of Pennsylvania and the city of brotherly love, and this benevolent Quaker is the story that most of us got when we were younger folks. But in fact, he also was a slave master. And there's some interesting stories here about this guy. You may not know, but at one point with a syndicate of other men, he bought what was then our province in two parts. He bought East and West Jersey, and he owned all of what is now New Jersey at one point. And it turns out that he had a family friend that lives over here by me in Monmouth County, in a place called Tinton Falls, named Lewis Morris. Lewis Morris was an Englishman who had come through the Caribbean, where he had plantations down in Barbados, brought slaves up from Barbados in the mid-17th century. And in Lewis Morris's last will and testament, which I've read, he bequeaths what he calls his personal servant, but a slave named Yaff, to William Penn. And the backstory to that is William Penn had, after he founded Philadelphia, gone back to London because he was a businessman. And Lewis Morris, as an inducement for him to come back, says in his will, I'll give you Yaff if you come back to the colonies. So it's kind of a quid pro quo. Now, what happens is Lewis Morris dies. He never saw William Penn again. But William Penn did come back at the end of that century. And Lewis Morris's same named nephew, who had inherited the estate over here, turned out to be, 3,000 acres of property run by slaves, frankly, presents this guy, Yaff, to William Penn, who takes him back to Philadelphia. And Yaff is with William Penn for the next 4 years, including up the river in Delaware. You may even have been there in your lifetimes, a place called Penn Manor, which is, kind of the country estate that William Penn built for himself. And then William Penn returns to London. And in 1703, he writes back to his secretary in Philadelphia. And he says, listen, I'm over here now with Yaff, and he's been faithful to me, so I'm going to free him. Now, it turned out that in April last year actually, I was going to go to England, stay with some friends, to look up possibly what had happened to Yaff. Because the last we know, he was left in a little town called Deal at the mouth of the Thames, after which Deal in New Jersey here by me is named. And even though William Penn in his letter back to Philadelphia says he would pay Yaff's passage back if the man chose, I don't think he would come back to a place he had been enslaved, with the exception if he would have had a wife and children here. But there's no record that he did. So maybe next year I'll be able to get over to England and find out if anything, because Yaff was a very accomplished guy. He spoke several languages. We know that he was probably born in Africa. Early on, he was enslaved and spent 20 years in Barbados with Lewis Morris, spent another 20 years up here in Monmouth County, and then Philadelphia, and then eventually London. So the guy had been in a lot of places, knew a lot of the famous people in our early colonial history, and had some skills. He was good with animals, according to William Penn's letter, was an accomplished guy. So I think he probably would have stayed in England and lived out his life, but to be determined. But again, my point here is slavery at this point in time was so engendered and entrenched in New Jersey from the top down that we'll talk about in a little bit here. So let me go backwards. How did this all begin? Well, it began with the Dutch, very honestly. And if you know a little bit about our history, when the Dutch took over New York, which they called New Amsterdam, and they called the entirety of their territory the New Netherlands up in that part of our state, to encourage colonization across the river in what is now New Jersey, they gave these guys called Dutch patroons, think of the word patron, 16-acre long pieces of land if they would bring other colonists in and develop it at a place called Bergen Neck. Now, to show you where that is, here's an old map. Right here on the right side, that's the battery down in lower Manhattan, which again, they called New Amsterdam. At the time in the 17th century, they called what we now call the Hudson River, the North River. And they wanted other Dutchmen to develop these land necks. Now, Bergen Neck, right here you can see the little town of Bergen. That happens to be about 3 blocks from where I went to college at St. Peter's in Jersey City. And down here in the rest of this neck of land is now Bayonne. So the Dutch were coming across the river and populating this. And the way they were doing that is they were bringing slaves that the Dutch West India Company was selling them. And so slavery very early in the 17th century gets a foothold through the Dutch into North Jersey. Enter these two guys who you know very well by name, if not by those pictures. And those are Berkeley and Carteret. In 1664, when the English take over from the Dutch, these guys do something that's an amazing, amazing part of our history. And what they do to encourage English colonization, they create a document. It's considered one of the founding documents of our state, called a Concession and Agreement of the Lords Proprietors. And within that document, they say for English colonists to come over, they'll give them 150 acres of land for every white person, 150 acres of land for every white servant, and 75 acres of land for every slave. So unfortunately, baked into our founding document in New Jersey is slavery. And what they're responding to is their own particular patron, the Duke of York, who had granted them basically all of New Jersey. Now, a few years earlier, in 1660, James, the Duke of York, established and was the principal stockholder to something called the Royal African Company. And that company was constituted in London specifically to go down to Africa to trade goods, precious metals, and people to bring them into the New World. And originally that was up through the Caribbean, like Barbados and other English colonies there, and then up into the 13 original colonies. And you can even see here in their corporate seal a couple of African men and an elephant. This company lasted for 80 years. And so these guys who are very friendly and had supported James, who becomes, by the way, James II in England, they had supported him during the English Wars of Succession, the Civil Wars, are working with him because they're business people. And these are business decisions. And so they're coming with slaves, these colonists, as quickly as they can because they're being rewarded with land. That company lasted 80 years. In fact, Perth Amboy was one of the entrepôts for slavery in New Jersey. The other one was Camden over closer to you all on the western part of the state. I mentioned Barbados because Barbados, it turns out, and there's an old image from Barbados, these are Quakers, they're business people. This man's holding and representing tobacco, which was the original crop in Barbados. Later, sugarcane comes in, it's a huge crop. But what they're doing with African slaves is they're developing a system that becomes the model, basically, for slavery in the 13 colonies up here in North America. In fact, as you already know, one of them, Lewis Morris, who I mentioned, did come up in the mid-1670s into my part of the world, which is Monmouth County. And he comes up there specifically with 60 slaves from his Barbadian sugar plantation because there's a waterfall there. And he can run his, and I should say the slaves can run his water wheels because they're grinding all the crops that he's growing. And he's shipping them up to New York. So again, slavery is based on economic development because we're the Garden State, right? We're agriculturally based in those days. This, by the way, is the second largest waterfall south of the Great Falls in Patterson. So Lewis Morris comes up there with these slaves. So now you have North Jersey here, okay, where slavery has started with the Dutch. The English now start to come into southern Jersey, and then it spreads. And just to get back to this little map over here, between the Hackensack and the Passaic Rivers in northeast Jersey, if you look here, they call this neck of land New Barbados because it's been populated by Barbadian planters who are coming up with their slaves. It doesn't take long for slavery to start flourishing, if you will. Here's a 1737 New Jersey census. We don't even have 21 counties yet. On the left side in these columns, these are the white people in 1737 in our state. You can see here about 43,500. And over here, Negroes and other slaves. And that mainly refers to Native American Lenape Indians who were also enslaved. And there's about, in that year, almost 4,000 enslaved people, representing about 8% of the then population. Now, slavery is growing by leaps and bounds, natural propagation, which on the surface sounds good, right? If you're a slaveholder and your slaves are having kids, this is great. You're getting free kids, free future slaves. But it's also doing a couple of other things. It's making white slaveholders really, really nervous for a good reason, because slaves, as you would suspect, are rebelling. And every chance they get, if they're not running away, they're threatening white people. In fact, a couple years after this, in 1741, across the river in New York City, there's this huge outbreak of a slave rebellion where slaves are going to burn, they plot to burn down New York. New York, by the way, is named after the Duke of York. They're going to burn it down. They're going to slash the throats of their white masters. And this thing gets brutally put down. The slaves are drawn, quartered, hanged, burned at the stake in some cases. And in the Caribbean, it's happening all the time, where slaves are rebelling, notably in Jamaica. You probably know about Haiti and all these other places. So the white slaveholders in our state respond to these threats, very real threats, by increasingly creating harsher and harsher laws to control the slave population, which we'll talk about. By the way, historically, by that 1800, the slave population in New Jersey gets to be about 10% of the overall. So it's a big number of enslaved people. So far I've talked about kind of, a little bit in North Jersey and a little bit on my side. But over in the west side of our state, slavery gets an early foothold as well. Again, with people from Philadelphia. And yes, they were Quakers, because Quakers originally were not associated with abolition. This guy, William Trent, friend of William Penn, as a matter of fact, he's a trader into the Caribbean for goods and people. And he decides with all his money that he's going to build a country estate. And he goes over to what was then called the Falls of the Delaware. And he builds that house in this image. And the area develops and becomes known as Trentstown, of course, Trenton eventually. And he brings his slaves over there. And what they do is they also run his mills. Here's a mills on a picture of a mill on Crossroads Creek, where they're grinding various kinds of grain for sale and making William Trent and other men even more wealthy. Enter this guy. Now, this guy is the Lewis Morris nephew that I mentioned before. And where he comes into play is by 1738, he's risen through the political ranks, if you will, and he becomes the first royal colonial governor of New Jersey in 1738. And he's in Tinton Falls over by me. He's got about 6,000 acres with probably 100 slaves at that point. And he decides to move the government, the fledgling government of New Jersey, to Trentstown. And his wife Isabella is going to go over with him, and they're going to bring some slaves to Trenton. But Isabella says, wait a minute, I'm not living with slaves in that house. So what happens is William Trent, I should say Lewis Morris, writes a letter to the guy that owned Trent's house. Trent has deceased by 1738. And the guy that owns it happens to be the governor of Pennsylvania, a guy named Thomas. And in a letter that we have in 1742, Lewis Morris says to him, I want to come over and rent that house from you for my seat of government, but I'd like you to put on a kitchen wing for my servants. So he's talking about slaves here. And the truth is that Isabella, nor any woman of her status, would not want to be living in the same house with their slaves. And secondly, you would put an outbuilding behind your house, a kitchen specifically for fear of fire. So Governor Thomas rents them the house and does build a kitchen in the back, and the slaves come over and they live there. Now, that house is still extant, and you may have been there. It's called the Trent House Museum today, and I've spoken there a few times. Now, that kitchen was out here in the yard, if you will. And a couple of years ago, a friend of mine who's an archaeologist at Monmouth University, Dr. Richard Veit, started some excavations to see what they could find. And I happened to go out there a few summers ago to see what was going on. Now, I can't tell you if that is the foundation that they found to the kitchen, because it's an ongoing investigation. But if it is, or another location that they should find it, what'll be interesting to see if they find artifacts left over by the slaves. Slaves had their own religious practices, as you would suspect, and they may have left remnants of how they lived, which may give us hints to where they came from, who they were, to be determined. But again, the point is that on both sides of our state, even though the western part of our state is more associated with Quakers, slavery is really by the 18th century everywhere, including famous places like Princeton, founded by a guy named Richard Stockton, another friend of William Penn. Buys this huge piece of property, and he brings his slaves to create even more of a family fortune. So here's Princeton. A lot of you have been there. I'm sure that's Nassau Street. Richard Stockton, famous family in New Jersey. His son, John, is the founder of Princeton University right there. And his son, named after the grandfather, Richard, this guy, Richard Stockton, is a slaveholder. He's also one of the first graduates of Princeton University down there. This Richard Stockton, during the Revolutionary War, is fighting the British. He gets captured, and he dies in a famous sugar house prison up in New York City in 1781. His slaves are then bequeathed to his wife. And some really, really interesting things and contradictory things happen with this. Stockton, by the way, not only builds Morven, which you may have been to too, it's right here. It becomes at one point our governor's mansion for a while in New Jersey. They today, by the way, have a very robust slavery exhibit there acknowledging the slave lives in the Morven plantation. But what happens is that not only is Richard Stockton, like about 38 other signers of our Declaration of Independence, slaveholders, he happens to, when he dies in prison, of course, now these slaves go to his wife. And his wife is Annis, her maiden name was Boudinot. She's a poetess, fairly famous. And then something really, really surprising happens after he dies. And I'm going to let you read it for a second because it may shock you. It turns out that one of her slaves that she inherited died in childbirth, and she had young children. So Annis Stockton wet nursed this young boy, Marcus Marsh, who stays with her for years, and she finally frees him. So this is the contradictory nature of slaveholding. At one hand, they treat people brutally as property, and then you see occasional kindnesses like this that make absolutely no sense. But it is exactly what's built into not New Jersey, but all of the slaveholding folks and regions in our country. At one hand, they don't believe Black people are people. On the other hand, they treat them sometimes as if they are. So that was a look at some, fairly famous families. But by the, 19th century, slavery is everywhere in New Jersey. And these two guys, kind of middle-class folks like the rest of us, I suppose, play a really, really interesting role in that. And they're representative, again, of middle-class folks. On the left is a guy named Charles Morgan, who's originally from Middlesex County, but he owns a sugar plantation down in what was called Point Coupee near Baton Rouge in Louisiana. And the other guy is his brother-in-law, who happened to be a judge up here, Jacob Van Wickle. Now, they come from a family that knows a lot about slavery. As a matter of fact, James Morgan, who also fought against the British in the Revolutionary War, Charles' father, was a slave catcher. And here's an ad he takes out during the Revolutionary War. He's trying to get a reward for a slave he captures. Very common in those days. You should know, I hope you know, that many, many slaves ran away to the British side during the Revolutionary War, specifically because the British promised them freedom if they helped put down what they thought was going to be a little rebellion. So the story of these two men that I've highlighted here is notorious, because in 1818, they do a horrible thing. And what they're doing is responding to a change in New Jersey's laws. In 1804, we passed something called the Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery. And that says that slaves born after that year are going to gradually, over a period of time, be freed. So if you're a slaveholder in the early, after 1804, you realize that your investment, which is how you look at slaves, are going to be worth less money. And these two guys realized that. And they also realized that down south, which is a fabulous agricultural economy, tobacco and sugar, and of course cotton, slaves are worth a lot more. So they come up with a scheme. And the scheme works like this. They lure free black people in New Jersey to Judge Van Wickle's house, and they tell them, hey, there's great jobs down south. We'll transport you down there. You can start your lives over again, make a lot of money, get property, and do all of these things. And it's a pack of lies. And Van Wickle, because he's a judge, has these folks sign papers, and we don't even know if they could all read, but he's telling them that they have to sign these papers, because by then New Jersey law says that if anybody signs that they will agree to go to another state, that'll be legal. So we still have these records, these phony consent forms that these people are tricked into signing, including, by the way, as in the image, some of these people were women with young children. They didn't have husbands for one reason or another, and they're deciding to go down south and start a new life. And they put over 100 free black people on a couple of ships in Perth Amboy. They ship them down to Louisiana, and as you would suspect, there's no jobs down there for them. Well, let me put it this way. There's jobs now for them down there, but not the way they think, because they sell these people. Charles Morgan keeps some for his own plantation, and they sell the rest of them. This is horrible. At least that number of what they call free Negroes shipped down. By the way, Charles' plantation was called Morganza, immodestly enough. Now, we know a lot about these folks because there's a project up here called the Lost Souls Project in Middlesex County that is commemorating them. And some of their descendants that I know have done their DNA, and they recognize that there are the descendants of these New Jersey slave or free people that were enslaved that still live in Louisiana and Mississippi. As far as we know, none of them were able to get back to New Jersey, and maybe because some of them were grown adults, and it was 1818, they may not have even lived to abolition after the Civil War, although some of the children may have. It's an infamous incident in our state's history. It's been written about over the years. I was privileged enough to hear from, believe it or not, Morgan descendants who corresponded with me when I was writing the book and told me a lot of their very deep family stories about this stuff. You can look that up if you'd like, that project. It's a wonderful project up in this part of the state to commemorate these people who were sold away. I want to talk to you now because I've kind of concentrated on the white slaveholding of actual enslaved people. And I'm a white person, so I can't imagine what it was like, but I'll do my best to tell you what I do know. This man, Charles Reeves, was born enslaved in Middletown, up here in Monmouth County, to a guy named David Williamson, who owned that house. Now, that house is about 3 blocks, still there, from where my kids went to grammar school in what is now Homedale, but was then Middletown. And Charles worked for at least 25 years enslaved because that 1804 Gradual Act for Abolition of Slavery made him stay enslaved until he was 25 years of age. Later in his life, he meets this woman, Hannah Van Cleef. She was also born enslaved in Middletown, possibly as part of the Taylor family in that part of the world, although that's not documented yet. But you can see from their names two really interesting things. Reeves is probably an English name, so someone of his ancestors may have been enslaved by English folks. Van Cleef is clearly Dutch. That represents the Dutch slaveholders in my part of the state. And that house behind her is the house that they were given, not sold, given in around 1850, and in which they lived with their 11 children. And that house stayed in their family for 4 generations. And I must have passed it many, many times when I lived in Middletown and didn't even realize it. It was there extant till about the 1970s. Now, their lives, because after he was freed about 1845, he worked for other farmers in the Middletown, New Jersey area. She stayed home, Hannah, of course, with these children that she was raising, 11 children. By the way, as you could probably tell, that shack had a dirt floor and not a whole lot of other facilities to raise children in. Their lives were influenced by the act that I told you about, because under the law, he would have been eligible to be manumitted in 1845. She, if we have her birth date right, would have been eligible about 1850. And their descendants, and I believe that that's exactly what happened, because we have their original marriage certificate given to me by one of their descendants. And they were married at the Homedale Baptist Church in 1850. So it makes sense to all of us that around the time they were both free, they would take their vows and start their lives in that house. And they became very prominent citizens in what is the Lincroft section of Middletown, very well respected. Charles worked his entire life as a farmhand. She was well known in town. They're written about in early town histories. Very prominent, well-known people. Now, another law, but a federal law, absolutely influenced their lives. And you may know about the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. And that's a federal law that was passed, pushed through, frankly, by the Southerners, because slaves were running away and they were losing people that they considered their property. And they were coming up north, not just in New Jersey, but everywhere, to get on what was then the Underground Railroad to get free. And so the law gets passed, and it creates this horrible set of restrictions that basically says, and we'll talk about New Jersey, that anybody in New Jersey caught sheltering or helping runaway slaves is subject to fine and imprisonment for helping them. And it also engenders slave catchers that get hired by these Southern planters. You've seen them in the movie 12 Years a Slave and maybe Harriet, who come up and have absolutely no morals. And if they catch Black people, they don't care if they're runaway slaves or not, they're going to bring them back south and sell them back into slavery. And so I think Charles and Hannah respond to that. And here's what I think happened. Now, there are a lot of images like this as a result of the Fugitive Slave Law. And there's well-documented stories of people being captured and sold into slavery, free Black people. And so what happens is, right after this law is passed, a couple of months later in Middletown, in the Lincroft section, a white guy, actually James Crawford, sells to 14 free Black men a 3-acre piece of property for a cemetery. It's now called the Cedar View Cemetery. I'm on a committee of folks that are trying to restore it and find out what we can. And what Charles Reeves does is he buys that property. This little chunk here, all of these plots, by the way, are about 100 by 40 feet. And I think he does that for a very good reason. He does it because he doesn't have any other property. That house that he's living in is basically lent to him while he's working for a farmer. And so I think he knows enough that if he has a deed of property, when anybody should confront him that he's run away, he could say, no, I'm not a runaway slave. I own property. And slaves, of course, couldn't own property. And so it shelters him and his family, as do a lot of these other plots. Other folks buy these. And that's that plot today. This is a cleanup we did in the fall. This is Charles Stone, and that's Hannah Stone. And these are other of their family members. They have more stones in that particular plot of this cemetery than any other family. You can also tell, by the way, that these are more modern stones. We know that one of their sons put them up later. I suspect they never even had a stone when they finally passed away. These are other of their children and relations. Now, how do I know any of this stuff? I know this stuff because I got lucky in my life. And I met this wonderful woman, May Edwards, who passed away a year ago, July. She is the great-granddaughter, was the great-granddaughter of Charles and Hannah. A marvelous person that I knew the last year of her life. She shared all of her family history with me. She had been a nurse up here in Riverview Hospital for her career, had done massive amounts of research over her life about her family, and alerted me as a white person to something I never recognized. I had always imagined that if Black people knew anything, it could be a generation or two back, that they had been sold and moved so many often in their lifetimes that they didn't know their history. Well, May Edwards gave a lie to that, and not only shared this history about her family with me, but she had become the president of the New Jersey chapter of the Afro-American Genealogy and Historical Society. Many people in that group, and it's a nationwide group, frankly, know a lot about their relatives back to slave times. And she was a marvelous person who just gave me so much information. I know her family very well now. I dedicated this book to her as a tribute to what a wonderful person she was. And there's a lot of stories about her family in the book if you ever get to it. I want to talk to you about another remarkable family that has a deep history with enslavement, the Still family. Down closer to most of where you are, these folks wound up in Burlington County. And actually, Levin and Charity Still were born in Maryland enslaved, but they heard about the 1804 Act for Gradual Abolition. So they come up with a plan, and Levin comes up and he's going to send for Charity and their kids once he establishes himself in New Jersey. And it didn't quite go the way they wanted to. She comes up, but has to go back. She gets caught and enslaved again. And then their life eventuates, as I'll tell you. They have about 14 kids over their lifetime, and many of their children become quite famous, prominent citizens, one of whom is James Still. James Still, you may know, as it's come down to us, it's called the Doctor of the Pines. He's a herbalist. He's revered by white and Black people in Burlington County during his career, although the white medical establishment didn't want to recognize him as a certified physician. And here's a book about his life that is just fascinating. He has one of his brothers is a guy named William Still. William Still winds up in Philadelphia and is considered one of the only one, but one of the fathers of the Underground Railroad. In fact, he writes a book about all of the things that he's involved with in the Underground Railroad in Philadelphia. In that book, he refers to a couple of his young brothers. And it's a fascinating story, which to me, as famous as these two and accomplished as these two men were, is even more remarkable. And the story is about their brother, this man, Peter Still. Now, this story here that William talks about is that when Charity, his mother, was back in Maryland trying to free her kids, one day she goes to church and two of her young sons get kidnapped and sold into Southern slavery. And Peter Still, one of the two little boys, about 8 years old, spends 40 years in Kentucky and Alabama and all these places being sold and resold away from his family. And eventually, one of his last slave masters allows him, and this is fairly common, to earn a little money on the side by doing odd jobs. And he gets enough money, does Peter, to buy his freedom. And he works his way up by train. He gets to Philadelphia. Somebody says, you should go down to the Underground Railroad place. And he walks in and he's being interviewed by a guy. And he's telling him about his life. And the guy happens to be William, who says to Peter, I think you're my brother. And Peter Still says, oh, that can't be. You know, how can this be? And he's very, very skeptical because, of course, he doesn't trust many people. He's been enslaved all his life. But sure enough, they determine that they are brothers. And William still says, not only that, how'd you like to meet Mom? Because their mother, Charity, is still alive, living in Burlington. And they bring Peter, a sister also, and William, bring Peter to see his mother, who he hadn't seen in 45 years. And the woman's astounded. And her first reaction, it's touching. Her first reaction, she runs out of the room, gets down on her knees and starts praying in gratitude. So they had this joyous family reunion, but that's not the end of the story. Because what Peter then does is he goes on a 4-year lecture tour of the North in order to raise money because he's got a wife and he wants to go back and free her and his children. And he finally raises $4,000. He goes back undercover into Alabama, buys his wife's freedom, and he and the kids come up and they settle in Burlington with his mother and the rest of the family. And not to be outdone by his brothers, there's a book all about that too, which I would recommend. I mean, this stuff is hair-raising, but it's a testimony to the resilience of people that come from slavery and what they're capable of doing in order to not only free themselves, but to take care of their families. It's remarkable. I absolutely happen to know a couple of their descendants that live over in the Burlington area to this day. Just remarkable people. You know, as you do know, slaves are running away all the time. During the Revolutionary War, hundreds of New Jersey slaves ran over to the British side and fought for the British because the British said, we're going to free you at the end of the war. Well, it didn't turn out that good for the British, and it really didn't turn out that good for the slaves either. Because at the end of the war, the British shipped about 3,000 of these folks that had fought with them up to Nova Scotia, where they had to start a whole new life again, although they were free, so that was something. And over time, as you know, down by you know, down here in Cumberland County and Salem County, develops in New Jersey what's called the Underground Railroad. And typically slaves that were running away, you know, not even during the war, but always, would come up the west side of the state, paralleling the Delaware, stay at all these little towns of which there are still safe house, you know, museums and memorials along the way. They'd try to get to the central part of the state, the thinnest part, come across. They're trying to get to New York City, sometimes through Staten Island, sometimes through Jersey City. And if they can get to New York, they can get up the Hudson and get free. And then, of course, you know, the most famous New Jersey conductor of the Underground Railroad of all, that woman. But you may not know her real name, because her real name is Araminta, or Minty Ross, who in her lifetime takes her mother's first name and her husband's, of course, last name, Tubman. Harriet Tubman originally is not from New Jersey, as famous as she is. She was born enslaved in Maryland, but does escape and comes up north and works, as a matter of fact, in Cape May in a hotel at some point in her life. 1849, she escapes to Philadelphia. Certainly. And by the way, gets directed to that guy, William Still, and they begin to work to free other enslaved folks. And this incredibly brave, not quite 5-foot-tall woman, we know at least 20 times goes back to try to free other people. Originally to get her husband out. Unfortunately, she gets back and finds out he's remarried. She frees her parents and goes back and forth, becomes a spy during the Civil War, and infiltrates Confederate camps because they wouldn't suspect this little black woman of doing anything other than, you know, being a servant or a slave, and has these incredible adventures, which I'm sure most of you know a lot about. The war is over, abolition happens, which I'll talk about. She gets married, retires to Auburn, New York, but doesn't stop. She gets involved in the early women's right to vote movement. She opens up an old age home for former slaves up there, and just is an incredible dynamo of a person. Finally dies after fighting the government, by the way, for a pension for her Civil War exploits, which she finally does get. And if we're really lucky one day, I hope we are, maybe this will be revised and we may see her on some currency, which seems to me the very least we can do for somebody that has such a monumental impact toward the end of enslavement, not only in New Jersey, but the whole country.
Hey, Rick, I do have one question that just popped in.
Great.
It's about the Still family, and someone asked if James and Peter Still were able to determine that they were blood brothers.
They absolutely were. Yeah, they knew each other. Later on, they also determined that Peter was their brother. They swapped a lot of stories to verify that. And by the way, there's a whole lot of other of their siblings that are still alive when Peter comes up north. So thank you. It gives me the opportunity to tell you all that in my book, purposely, I have 12 pages of bibliography of people that have been writing, black and white scholars, about New Jersey slavery that I would recommend, including those couple of books that I talk about. But the Still family is remarkable, and they have relatives that live down in Salem and Burlington County to this day. But thank you for that. So how did we as a state finally get to abolition? So as painful as that might have been for you all to watch that 5-second thing, it took New Jersey about 200 years to come to grips with this horrible thing that we did. And one of the ways we did it, sadly, was through a series of laws. And I got to just highlight some of them. And believe me, there are a lot of them. One of the very earliest laws in New Jersey was called the Act for Regulating of Slaves. And what it's about is people are reacting to the threat of slaves running away or threatening them physically. And it's got all kinds of harsh things in there, like slaves need to have passes if they're off their master's property, which they could be sent for shopping or who knows what. And oh, by the way, if they're caught without a pass off their master's property, any white person can beat them, kill them with no penalty, but more likely than not, bring them back to their master for a reward. They're not able to read or write. They're forbidden to be taught to read or write, and a whole lot of other horrible things, including this, because early Quakers are starting to, kind of talk about abolition. And in an effort to address that, the law says, oh, okay, if you want to free slaves, you can, but you got to give us got to give the state 200 pounds. And then 20 pounds every year after that, this person you're freeing lives. Now, that 200 pounds is $38,000 and another $3,800 for every year. No one's going to do that. You're not going to free somebody, even though you might want to, because there's a penalty. You got to pay a lot of money. And the facetious part of the second part of this is that it's assuming incorrectly that slaves can't support themselves. And what's facetious about that is slaves have done everything that white people told them to do. They're shipwrights and they're carpenters and they're blacksmiths and they're, anything. And so they could very well support themselves. But this is another way that white people look paternalistically at people they didn't view as human. So it's an unpopular law, but it does last for the better part of the century. You already know about that act that we mentioned. But it says specifically that slave women who have children after, ironically, right, July 4th, the women, the babies that are female, have to serve as slaves for 21 years, men for 25. So that's, in those days, that's a third of a person's life. By 1844, we have a constitution that sounds terrific, because in that Constitution, New Jersey says all men are free and independent. Sounds great, right? Except that the entrenched powers that had a lot to do with slavery, even though more and more slaves are being freed after that law was passed, the earlier laws, they get all excited. They bring this constitutional mandate to the Supreme Court, which says, oh, wait a minute, takes a year. New Jersey Supreme Court says, what we really meant were white men. We don't mean women. We certainly don't mean slaves. We don't mean Native Americans. We mean white men. It's agonizing. That year, we say, okay, wait a minute. We got it this time. We're not kidding. We're really going to abolish slavery. But you know what we do as a state? In 1846, we say, if you're a slave today, you have to be an apprentice for the rest of your life. So it doesn't matter to a black person what you call them. If you're not treating them like a fully embraced human being, they're still a slave. Now, we see the results, by the way, in the census records. After 1804, as more and more people start to get manumitted, by the 1850 and certainly the 1860 federal census, we find that there are, in 1860, 18 slaves on the rolls as enslaved in New Jersey. But it's actually not true, because hidden in the census are these so-called apprentices. They're just not called slaves anymore. So we have more slaves going into the Civil War period than is in the official record. So you see how long it took us, the better part of 200 years to come to grips with this thing. How did we finally get rid of all this? Well, also embarrassing to me as a New Jersey guy was we're the only northern state that never voted for Abraham Lincoln. All right? We didn't do it the first time around. And the second time when he ran for re-election, by the way, General McClellan, who happened to be a Jersey guy, was running. So our electoral votes both times went toward the opposing candidates. You know the story, right? Lincoln gets inaugurated. Basically, that precipitates the Civil War. Later on, South Carolina secedes. It's fought over slavery. Everybody knows that these days. And we have this horrible period of time during which Abraham Lincoln issues that. Now, as good as that was, it only freed the slaves in the states of rebellion for two reasons. Lincoln wanted to make a statement, and also he didn't have the right under constitutional law to take away people's property. The slaves that were owned by people in the North, the few that there were, he couldn't just arbitrarily decide they were free. And there's also stories, true stories, that Lincoln, one of Lincoln's thoughts was, let's do this recolonization so-called effort. One of the ways he considered, through other people, of getting rid of the slave problem was sending these slaves to Costa Rica, back to Africa. And the irony there is that's not where they were from. By the mid-19th century, very few people are around that were born in Africa. They're Americans. Anyway, he does free, by proclamation at least, the slaves in the South. And then you know how the story plays out, right? Lincoln gets assassinated in April of '65. The Civil War is over a few months later. And then 75%, 27 of the then existing states ratify the 13th Amendment, which finally abolishes slavery. Oops. We didn't want to go along. Fait accompli. By December, it was going to be passed and ratified, and New Jersey said, okay, we'll go along. We just didn't want to. We had this incredible history of enslaving Black people, and we weren't comfortable as a state, not everyone, of course, with doing this. By the way, later on, when the 14th Amendment comes around, we ratify that as a try to claw back our ratification. That's got to do with citizenship and all kinds of really, really what we consider basic things these days. But New Jersey kind of lagged. 150 more years go by, and New Jersey finally, through our legislature, issues this wonderful document that you can look on online if you don't know it already, where we acknowledge and apologize for what we did. Guess what's missing? It's a good start. It's nice. But there's nothing in there that says we have to come to grips with what we did to these people, and now, of course, their descendants after all these years. And I think you're going to see, I hope we all see, some real concrete addressing of reparations, because the people that built this country are Americans. And this is American history. This is not Black American history. It's American history. And the people that helped us build this country are owed something. That's my personal belief. Okay, so I'm going to stop now, but I want to emphasize there's the book, by the way, that's Charles Reeves, and that's an unidentified Black person, probably enslaved from a portrait in a historic association here up by me. As Valerie mentioned, she's got some signed copies that the society has, so you can get those from her. She'll tell you how. Or if you'd like signed and dedicated copy for a gift, you already have my email. And I would ask you too that if you have anything else that you want to contact me about later on after we finish up here, by all means, please reach out. And so, Valerie, with that, we can open up the mics, or you can ask questions, or anybody can say whatever they want. Whoop.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so very much. That was absolutely fascinating. We are very grateful to have you here and joining us. And yes, we do have a few more books still left at the Society. You can reach out to us, email or Facebook, or stop out. We'd love to see you there. And pick up a book. And if you have any information or you missed the email, Rick's email, you let us know, reach out, and I will be happy to send that your way. And if anybody has questions or anything else they want to add, go right ahead. You should.
By the way, one last thing before I take questions. We recorded this session, and I'm going to get that to Valerie, and I assume you'll put it up on your website or something.
Exactly. We're going to get a YouTube channel rolling, and we're going to add that to our Facebook page. And so anybody who wants to watch again and or share with friends who might not have been able to make it, we'll have that available as well.
Okay, folks, fire away. And come on, you New Jersey people, I know you have a lot to say.
Rick, I have a question for you from up in Sussex County.
Yes.
You showed a map that depicted the Underground Railroad passing basically up along the southwestern corner of the state, cutting through the middle part and going over to New York. Is there any indication that there was ever an Underground Railroad passing up through Warren and Sussex County?
So, you know what? I'm not an expert on every path that was taken, but I'm sure that there are folks that went all different directions. Now, I will tell you that over the years that I've done research on this topic, and even before I even knew anything about it, there are people throughout New Jersey and other states who say, oh, you know, my grandmother's house was part of the Underground Railroad because it's got a root cellar. And I always say, I hope that's true, but you really need to document it. You know, I want it to be true. And oh, yes, as far as Sussex County and other places, you know, those are known pathways that I showed in that map. And by the way, it's not my map, it's from other people that have really delved into it. But, you know, people running away will go any way they can. And if you get in the back of a wagon and somebody says, I live up in, you know, the northeast or northwest part of New Jersey, but I can get you free, you know, you're going to do that. So I don't specifically know anything about your particular part of the world, but I'm sure that there are folks that escaped up that way as well. But typically they were trying to get to New York City.
The only reason I ask is, as president of our county historical society, I've never seen any documentation about anything in our county. I know over in Milford, Pennsylvania, yes, they do. Yeah. And that's the reason I questioned whether it came up the west side of the river up to Milford and then further north through New York, or it stayed on our side of the river.
Well, it's a great question. I'm sure escaped runaways went anywhere they could. By the way, I'm part of a project that you might want to know about. We're putting online a free database of all the slavery records we can garner, specifically so that people, researchers, and descendants of slaves can maybe find out about their forebears. And so, if anybody in your society, Wayne, or you want to contact me about what you know up there, I'd be more than happy to help.
I'd be happy to pass that on. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Rick?
Yes.
Are you familiar with the Underground Railroad Museum? I think it's in East Hampton, New Jersey. And also, could you possibly comment on that? And also, Lawnside, New Jersey.
I am familiar with it. And ironically, you know, this book came out in January. Ironically, last spring, I wanted to visit all of those places. And then guess what happened? You already know what happened. So
Yeah.
a lot of those places, Lawnside in particular, there's a whole story of a family down there in my book. I have not gotten to. I have a friend down there, Al Corbett, you might know, who's involved in several of those. He's a trustee on several of those museums. And I would urge everyone, and you have to check online because a lot of them are temporarily closed, obviously. There's rich history that I did want to explore, Johnny, and I was just not able to get there. So I took what I could of, real poignant stories of white and black people that worked together to free other folks all through that part of our state. And as Wayne just alluded, I hope that other people come up with documentation everywhere to find out what we can about these stories. By the way, there's a famous website you can look up now. Anybody can look it up. It's called enslaved.org. And there's a tremendous amount of material as scholars are unearthing a lot of material that has been buried. By the way, I know, and I'm a big believer, obviously, in historic societies. Historical societies in New Jersey and everywhere else are just finding what they have in their holdings. They don't even know all the time what's there. So I'm sure Valerie will help you down in Cumberland County find whatever you can through their auspices. But Johnny, I would recommend, thank you for bringing that out. I think there's 8 or 10 different museums and houses of folks that were instrumental in the Underground Railroad in that part of the state.
Thank you for the presentation, Rick.
Thank you. Who else might have a comment or a question or anything for that matter?
Rick, I was late signing on and I was wondering, are you teaching somewhere?
So thank you for that. Great question. So what I've been involved in over the last couple of years and now more than ever actually is trying to work through, we have something in New Jersey called the Amistad Commission. And the Amistad Commission was empowered in 2008 to infuse this history into our school districts. And so I'm working on a couple of pilot programs with several school districts, working with their teachers, although I'm a former teacher, to bring a lot of this to light. Now, unfortunately, there wasn't a lot of funding for this. And so although it's mandated by state law that these histories of African Americans have to be taught, unfortunately, a lot of teachers, even though there are curricula out online now through the Amistad Commission, they're teaching stuff, in a week or 2 weeks or whatever it might be. And you all remember, when we were all in school, I mean, I don't know, when did the Civil War last? A week maybe? That, because they're trying to cover a lot of material. And I think the latest scholarship is showing, and the latest sociological, if you will, events in our country is showing, this is American history that is more vital than ever. It's my belief, and one of the reasons I wrote the book, by the way, was that unless we can come to grips with the past, where are we going to go? And I'm not naive enough to think that knowing this is good enough. It's nice to know, but the challenge that I have for myself and other folks is, all right, now that you know this, which I think explains a lot about where we are today, what are you going to do with this? It's good to know, but how do we put this into action? And so I'm involved, and I'm sure a lot of you are too, in various groups of people that are doing things to try to, if you will, bring the whole society into a better place. So it's a long-winded answer to it, probably a shorter question. Sorry.
No, I appreciate it. And I just mentioned in the chat that there's a new museum in Cape May, the Harriet Tubman Museum, which I've not been to yet. Not sure it really opened during the pandemic, maybe a soft opening, but I believe it's going to address the Underground Railroad from the Cape May going north viewpoint.
You're exactly right. I did contact those people. It was another place I was not able to get to. And I think that they did have a kind of a soft opening. And I think, and we can all go online, that they're getting close, like the rest of us are, maybe in the summer to opening that up. And I don't know what they know about Harriet Tubman, but I do know that there are stories that she worked down there in a hotel at one point in her life. So we have all of these resources in New Jersey. I mean, I got to tell you, the state archives and a lot of places that are temporarily closed, have a tremendous amount of material that we're just starting to explore. So
Thank you very
for that.
much.
Hey, Rick,
Thank you for that. Yes.
on the Peter Still story, back in 2012, I was staying with someone in Cincinnati, and she started to tell me about work she'd done on the Still family. And I said, what's this person in Cincinnati doing talking about this? She was a member of the Jewish congregation in Cincinnati, where Joseph Friedman was from, who was the person who bought Peter Still in order to emancipate him. And she has sort of followed the story of their relationship and wrote up, she's passed away now, but she wrote up a piece about correspondence between them, and she interviewed some of the descendants as well. So I will send that to you.
Yeah, I'd like to see that. And that brings out what's happening now. There are so many people that are feel comfortable finally, I think, to reveal family stories, and there's archives. Everybody here in their attic, I hope, has something from their grandparents or whatever in your albums or whatever. And I often forget what I have, and then I go, oh wait, this has got to do with something. And there's all of this stuff that now that people are more comfortable with this kind of history that they're exploring, and I'm looking forward to all the scholarship. And again, I have to give a plug. I purposely chose the title of the book, by the way. This is not an academic tract. This is something that that I hope is readable, so that people will look in the back and find out the wonderful Black scholars who can tell a story as only they can, by the way, about this history. And I was shocked that I spent my entire life through my master's at Montclair State up north and never heard about slavery in New Jersey. Yet people have been writing about it for years. So I would direct your attention to that or any other resource you can. Just Google slavery in New Jersey, and you're going to see stuff that'll just delight and surprise you at the same time, I hope. Anyone else have anything? So, okay, listen, Valerie, great job getting, there was almost 50 people on this call, which is huge. Thank you. And I know you could all be doing a lot of other things, so I appreciate it. You've got my email to contact me about anything. Be happy to correspond with you. I often say this, but it's true. I learn a lot when I give these talks because people, as you already heard, say to me, hey, did you know this? And I don't pretend to know everything about a topic this broad and this wide. So by all means, reach out if you have to and can. So Val, thanks again to the Vineland Group for putting this up, and it's fabulous. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone who joined us. And that was absolutely fascinating. And again, reach out for some more information. We're going to follow up with an email, little survey. And again, I'll stick some information on there so that if you want to reach out to Rick, if you want to stop out at the Society and pick up a book. And we do have a donation link too, if you feel so led to help out the Society. That would be wonderful as well. But thank you so much. That was absolutely wonderful.
Well, my pleasure, and hope you all have a good afternoon. And spring is less than a month away, so there's hope for the world.
Yep.
We can all unmute and give this man an applause.
Yes.
Thank you very much. But give yourself an applause too. Give yourself an applause too, because it's important that you decided that you wanted to find out about something that's not a necessarily uplifting commentary on our state. But thank you all.
Love and blessings to all. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. All right, we'll see you all again, I hope.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
All right.